HOA Karen called 911 on my dad. She didn't know the judge would drag the governor into it. My dad was fishing on the lake my family has owned for generations when the HOA president called 911 and had him dragged off like a criminal. That night, as I drove toward the cabin I inherited, something in me snapped, and I swore I'd uncover every lie they built on our shoreline. If you've ever fought for what's yours, hit subscribe and stay with me. The wind was barely a whisper against my apartment window in Billings when the phone rang. One of those late-night calls that lands in your gut before your ears catch up. I glanced at the clock glowing on the nightstand. 11:42 p.m. My mother's name flashed across the screen, and something in me tightened. She never called this late. Not once in all my 38 years. When I answered, her voice didn't sound like hers. It was thin, trembling, like she was trying to hold herself together with the frayed ends of a whisper. "Evan, it's your father. They took him in an ambulance. He collapsed. His heart..." The room tilted. I pressed the phone harder to my ear, as if that could steady anything. "What happened? Mom, what happened?" Her breath hitched. It was the HOA people. That Stark woman called 911, said he was trespassing. Trespassing. On the lakefront he'd fished since before I was born. On the cabin property I inherited last spring when my uncle passed. On Callister land, our land, carved into deed and memory 3 generations deep. For a moment, all I heard was the quiet hum of my apartment, the refrigerator cycling, the faint buzz of streetlights outside. Then her words punched through again. "They pushed him, Evan. He fell. He couldn't get up." I was already grabbing my keys. The drive from Billings to Silver Trail Basin takes 3 hours on a good night, but I doubt my truck ever touched the speed limit. The Montana night unfurled before me. Black sky, empty highway, stretches of sagebrush melting into shadow. My headlights cut through waves of dust that rose behind passing semis, the world narrowing to a tunnel of light and urgency. Every few miles, my mother's voice replayed in my mind, broken at the edges. "Your father wouldn't leave the shoreline. He said he had every right. They yelled at him. Then he dropped to his knees." I pinched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles burned. Harold Callister wasn't the kind of man who bent easy. 67 years old, retired park ranger, tougher than most men half his age. He'd taught me to read the forest by scent, to read the lake by the way the wind touched its surface, to read people by their pauses. If he'd collapsed, something real had happened. Something that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding, the way HOA boards love to frame their power trips. The road curved around an old cattle fence. I eased the truck slightly, letting the memory hit me fully. Marilyn Stark, HOA president, self-appointed queen of Silver Trail Estates, calling 911 to report a trespasser on a property my family owned outright since the 1960s. As if a woman who moved here 8 years ago had more claim to that shoreline than the man who built half the walking trails around it. The absurdity twisted into anger, rising slow and hot, the way a storm brews over the basin. What gave her the right? What made her think she could shove my father out of his own land? Why call the police instead of listening to him explain the deed he could recite from memory? That last question gnawed the most. The air thinned as I climbed toward the ridge overlooking the valley. In the distance, I could almost imagine the outline of the lake, tucked between dark pines and the pale spine of the mountains. That cabin wasn't just lumber and nails. It was our history. My uncle built the newer dock himself. My father restored the porch after a windstorm in '09. I spent every summer of my childhood jumping off the rock ledge that locals called Callister Point. Now an HOA president thought she could erase all of that with a warning sign and a 911 call. I forced myself to breathe as I descended into the basin, the moon sliding across the lake like a smudge of silver. The cabin lights were off, but squad car tire tracks were carved deep into the dust along the drive. Seeing them felt like being punched from the inside. At the hospital, the fluorescent glow made everything appear too sharp. Chairs, tiles, even the framed nature prints on the walls. My mother sat hunched in a plastic seat, fingers wrapped around a paper cup. She looked up as I approached, relief flooding her tired face. "He's stable," she said. "They're keeping him overnight. The doctors said it was stress-induced. His heart rhythm jumped." I swallowed hard. "Because of them." She nodded. A nurse passed us with a clipboard, shoes squeaking softly on the floor. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and warm air. Clean, but unsettling. Somewhere in the background, a monitor beeped steadily, like a clock ticking down to a truth I hadn't yet heard. I sat beside her. "Mom, tell me everything." She did, and with each detail, the raised voices, the threat to call police, the shove that sent my father down, the anger in me coiled tighter, turning colder. By the time she finished, one question hammered through my skull, sharper than every other thought crowding my mind. Why did the HOA call the cops on the legal owner of the lake? I didn't know the answer yet. But I knew this. By the end of tomorrow, I would. The morning came too early, too bright for the kind of night we'd lived through. A thin Montana sun pushed over the ridge like it was unsure it wanted to start the day. I stepped out of the hospital just as a cold breeze rolled across the parking lot, carrying that familiar scent of pine bark and wet earth. It was the same smell that drifted off the lake on summer mornings when Dad and I used to fish at dawn. This time, it only tightened something in my chest. I climbed into my truck and headed toward the cabin. Gravel hissed under my tires as I turned off the main road, entering Silver Trail Basin proper, past the new houses built too close together, past the spotless mail kiosks and manicured shrubs. All of it bore the stamp of the HOA, stamped over land most of them didn't understand and didn't bother respecting. The farther I drove, the quieter things became. The forest thickened, the air cooled, and then, finally, the lake came into view, dark, still, reflecting the pale sky like a piece of tempered glass laid between the pines. That view alone used to calm me. This morning, it only reminded me of the pain in my mother's voice. I parked in the dirt patch beside the old cabin storage shed. The grass was still bent where the ambulance had driven over it. A few feet farther down, I saw the impressions of heavy boots, pressed deep, chaotic, like someone had been pacing, confronting, pushing. I walked down the slope toward the shoreline, my boots sinking into damp soil. That's when I saw the first sign of it, a stark white board with glossy blue lettering, planted firmly in our ground. Pine Ridge Lake, members only, no unauthorized access. Unauthorized, on Callister land. I crouched down to look at the base of the sign. The wooden posts were too new. They still smelled like fresh-cut lumber, edges sharp, no weathering. Someone had installed this very recently. Too recently to be coincidence. The next thing I noticed wasn't the sign. It was the soil around it. The earth was churned up the way it looks when a post-hole digger bites through ground that hasn't been disturbed in years. Bits of sawdust still clung to the dirt. Whoever did this wasn't even trying to hide it. I followed the line of the shoreline north, and soon another shape emerged. Something long, narrow, and entirely out of place against the natural curve of the water. A dock, not ours. 15 feet of clean pine deck boards stretching onto the lake, mounted with brand new cleats for boats that didn't belong here. The sun caught on a metal plate screwed into the side. Installed by Silver Trail Estates HOA. A breath left me, half disbelief, half a low simmer of anger. Dad had mentioned new people fishing off some platform lately, but I'd assumed he was talking about the old driftwood raft my uncle used to tie up. This was built with money. Money that shouldn't have touched this shoreline. Footsteps snapped a twig behind me. I turned. Tom Halper stood at the tree line, hands tucked into an old canvas jacket, shoulders hunched like the morning chill was trying to push him into the ground. At 82, Tom moved like a man who had seen enough to know when not to rush. He cleared his throat, gaze bouncing from the new dock to the sign behind me. "I figured you'd be out here," he said quietly. "Tom." I stepped toward him. "Did you see any of this go up?" He huffed. "Saw them bringing equipment last week. Didn't think much of it until yesterday." His eyes softened with something like guilt. "Your dad was fishing right there when they came at him. Barely got his line in the water." My jaw tightened. "Mom said they shoved him." Tom nodded once, slow. "Stark wasn't alone. She had 2 of those private patrol boys with her. They're not real deputies, you know. Hired through some contractor from downstate. They like to puff up their chests, act official." He shifted his weight. "Your father tried to explain. Told them this was Callister land. Always has been. They didn't want to hear it." I let my gaze drift back to the shoreline. The gravel path I hadn't noticed before curved from the HOA boundary straight onto our land, like a vein carrying the wrong blood. Trash cans with the HOA logo stood at the edge of the trees. A bench faced the water as if waiting for someone else's sunrise. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. Tom sighed. "Years, Evan. Little things at first. Folks from up the hill wandering down, saying the board opened access to the lake. Then the newsletters started calling it a community amenity. Nobody questioned it because, well, who wants to fight with an HOA? But Stark, she's different. She thought no one would push back." A bird cried somewhere high in the pines. The lake barely moved, its surface a thin sheet of silver morning light. Everything looked so peaceful that for a moment it almost felt like I'd imagined last night's phone call. But the signs and structures said otherwise. I walked back toward the first sign, sweeping my hand across its cold surface. The letters felt raised, sharp. Manufactured entitlement. Public ownership pasted over private land. Tom stepped closer. "Your grandfather never wanted trouble. He let folks fish as long as they respected the place. But he never gave it up. Never." He swallowed. "I know this is hard, son. But they crossed a line. They've been creeping farther every year. Stark just finally got bold enough to shove." The wind picked up, brushing leaves across the dirt. It felt like the lake itself was exhaling, tired of being spoken for. I knelt and pressed my palm into the soil beside the sign, feeling the cool, damp ground. My family's ground. My father's ground. The thought of him lying in a hospital bed while strangers hammered stakes into this earth sent another pulse of anger through me. "This isn't ending with last night," I said softly. Tom studied me for a long second. "No," he answered. "I don't reckon it will." Behind us, the water lapped gently against the new dock, each sound like a reminder. Steady, soft, patient. But patience only lasts so long. I stood staring out across the lake as clouds drifted overhead, shifting the light. If this had been going on for years, what else were they hiding? A thin breeze rolled across the water, barely disturbing its surface but carrying the scent of damp pine needles and mineral-rich soil, the kind of smell that takes you back decades. I felt the pull of it, but only for a moment. The rest of me tightened into purpose. I wasn't just looking at a lake. I was looking at a crime scene that had been dressed up to look like a community park. I began walking the curve of the shoreline, boots crunching through old fir needles and soft patches of moss. The water beside me was still dark with morning, reflecting the muted sky like a long sheet of gray glass. I'd walked these banks thousands of times growing up, but now every step felt like stepping into someone else's bad idea, something foreign laid on top of what had once been familiar. The farther I went, the more wrong everything looked. The second sign wasn't even 50 yards from the first. Another obnoxious board with the HOA crest, the kind you'd expect outside a gated community, not on the edge of a family lake that predated the subdivision by 4 decades. The corners hadn't yet weathered. The bolts were new and bright. Beyond it, a gravel path, one I definitely didn't recognize, cut straight from the HOA property line into our land. The gravel was that pale, sharp type contractors deliver by the truckload. Good for foot traffic. Good for pretending permanent access. Bad for anyone trying to prove they never granted it. I took photos of everything. Wide shots, close shots, boot prints, timber grain, gravel composition. My engineering background made me particular about documentation. Every bolt, every wood knot, every post angle could matter later. As I rounded the bend, something else came into view. 2 benches positioned to face the water. They looked absurdly peaceful sitting out there. Dark-stained wood, backs angled just slightly for comfort. But that peace evaporated the second I saw the HOA logo burned into the slats. Who burns a logo into a bench sitting on someone else's land? I knelt down, running a hand along the edge. The wood was smooth. Someone had sanded it carefully, intentionally. They'd taken time, not just money, to make sure the installation looked official. Behind me, a faint creak of branches broke the quiet. I thought it was Tom again, but when I turned, no one was there. Just wind passing through the trees, making the shadows shift. For a moment, it almost felt like the forest itself was trying to warn me to tread carefully. I stood and followed the new path all the way to where it met the HOA boundary marker, an iron post with reflective tape driven firmly into the ground. That part was legitimate. I recognized the county-issued seal etched at the bottom, but right beside it, just inches over the line onto our land, there was a mounted board of laminated lake rules. No swimming after 9 p.m. No motorized boats above 10 HP. Fishing permits required. Pick up at HOA office. Fishing permits. On a lake that belonged to the Callisters since 1964. I took a long breath, letting the cold settle in my lungs before exhaling slowly. If I didn't keep control of myself, my next move wouldn't be calculated. And this needed calculation, every inch of it. I continued along the shore, documenting every violation. With each step, the pit in my stomach grew heavier. This wasn't accidental encroachment. This was orchestrated, planned, built in phases over years. Each addition small enough that no one piece drew attention, but big enough that, over time, it became a constructed reality, a manufactured truth. As I moved farther north, something new caught my eye, something that felt even more deliberate than the others. A narrow wooden pier, shorter than the main dock, but sturdier. Built with wider planks, reinforced with steel brackets, anchored deep. The kind of structure meant for repeated use. A small HOA sign hung at the end, flapping lightly in the breeze. Authorized board members only. Board members only. On my family's lake. I crouched and touched the wood. It was cold from the night air, but underneath, I could feel the density, the quality. Someone had paid real money for this, not the HOA residents' pocket change. This was thousands of dollars in labor and materials. I straightened, scanning the shoreline, and caught the faintest shimmer beneath the water. Metal stakes. They'd secured the structure right into the lake bed. You don't go to that trouble unless you think the place belongs to you. Wind rippled across the lake, sending a wave of tiny shudders along its surface. The sound was soft, almost soothing, but beneath it, I heard something else. the distant hum of a motor, faint but steady. I looked up to see a small HOA patrol boat cruising the opposite side, moving slow like it was surveying territory. Territory it had no business policing. I stepped back into the shadow of a pine as they passed, partly to stay hidden, partly because I didn't trust myself not to march into the water and flag them down. They didn't notice me, or maybe they didn't care. When the boat's noise faded, the shoreline felt too quiet again, too staged. I kept walking until I reached a place where the land dipped. At the base of the slope, I spotted something half buried, a scrap of plastic protruding from the mud. I pulled it free. A corner of a torn HOA brochure. It listed lake access fees, printed neatly in bold blue type. I stared at the soaked paper in my hand, feeling the anger pulse low and steady under my ribs. For years, they'd been charging people for access to this lake. Access to something they had no right to sell, police, or profit from. The clouds above finally parted enough to spill light across the water. For a moment, the lake turned silver bright, almost glowing. That's when the truth hit me. This wasn't just misuse. This was theft, dressed up in neighborhood regulations. The question was no longer whether they'd crossed a line. The question was how far past it they'd gone, and how long they'd been lying to everyone on both sides of the water. And more importantly, what would I find next if I kept digging? I slipped the torn brochure into my jacket pocket and headed back toward the cabin. My father's voice echoed in memory, steady, patient, worn from years outdoors. Son, land remembers what's true. People just forget. The lake remembered. I intended to remind everyone else. By the time I reached the cabin again, the sun had climbed higher, but hadn't warmed much. Early light filtered through the tall pines, turning the air a pale gold that barely touched the cold settling into my shoulders. The cabin looked the same as it always had, weathered wood, tin roof, smoke-stained chimney, but this morning, something about it felt like it was holding its breath. Inside, the floorboards creaked with familiar protest. Dust hung in the air like a quiet fog where sunlight cut through the windows. Even after all these years, the place smelled the same. Old cedar planks, lake water dried into clothes left too long on hooks, and the faint hint of wood smoke from winters long past. I walked straight to the storage loft ladder. Something in my gut told me answers wouldn't be found on the shoreline alone. My grandfather kept everything that mattered in this cabin. Maps, deed copies, even fishing logs from the 1970s. If anyone predicted an HOA might someday try to swallow his land, it would have been him. The ladder groaned under my weight as I climbed. The loft opened into a low wooden space filled with boxes stacked along the rafters, old toolkits, a coil of rope, jars of screws, and 2 milk crates stuffed with paper. I knelt beside the crates, lifting the first one onto an old wool blanket. The contents smelled of age, paper fibers softening, ink fading. Most were boring: property tax receipts, fishing licenses, insurance forms. But in the second crate, buried beneath an outdated county map, I found a manila folder with a title written in my grandfather's neat, angled handwriting. Property, Lake. My pulse kicked. I pulled the folder open, careful not to rip the brittle edges. Inside were survey maps from the 1950s and 60s, photographs of the lake's original boundaries, and the deed. Yellowing but unmistakably official. I'd seen copies before, but holding the original felt different, heavier. But tucked behind the deed, folded 3 times, was something that froze me in place. A letter, addressed to Pine Ridge Lake Association, Atienne. Board of Directors, 1987. The HOA didn't even exist in its current form back then. Just a small community group. I unfolded the paper gingerly. The ink had faded, but my grandfather's words were still clear, unwavering in their tone. As a courtesy, I permit neighbors to fish and access the lake under the understanding that such access is not a transfer of rights and may be revoked at any time. This is not a deed alteration. This is not an easement. Lake ownership remains solely with the Callister family. It hit me like a rush of cold water. He'd known. He'd seen the future before it arrived. And he'd protected the lake the only way he knew how, with clarity in writing. This letter alone detonated any claim the HOA could make about established use. If anything, their use had always been permission-based, courtesy-based, revocable at any time. I read the letter again, slower, letting the truth settle into me. The script was tight, deliberate. A man who understood boundaries, not just physical, but legal. A twist of emotion rose unexpectedly. Pride, grief, maybe both. My grandfather had spent his life tending this land, and even in 1987, he'd anticipated someone trying to take advantage of his generosity. Wind rattled the cabin's shutters. I looked up toward the slanted roof, feeling the silence settle thickly around me. If this letter had been sent to the board back then, someone had received it. Someone in their files. Or someone who didn't want it in their files. Which meant the current HOA board had either hidden it or destroyed the copy they were supposed to keep. I leaned back on my heels, running a hand across my face. My heartbeat felt like a steady drum against my ribs. There was no way they didn't know. I pulled out my phone and snapped pictures of the letter from every angle. Front, back, close-up of the date, the signature. Then I placed the original into a protective sleeve I found in the crate. My grandfather might have written it decades ago, but today it felt like he'd reached across time and handed me a weapon. I carried the folder downstairs and set it on the old kitchen table. The wood was scarred from years of my father sharpening knives on it, carving fish he caught out on the lake. I spread out the maps and the deed, each one tied into the next like threads of a story the HOA hoped we'd forgotten. Outside, a car engine rumbled faintly. I walked to the window and spotted a dark SUV crawling slowly along the gravel near the end of the property. It paused, idling, then eased forward again. I didn't recognize the vehicle, but the behavior wasn't new. HOA board members had a habit of monitoring anything that threatened their sense of control, and last night's confrontation must have lit up their radios. I didn't step outside, not yet. Instead, I stayed in the shadows of the cabin and watched as the SUV crept along the boundary, paused again, then drove back toward the subdivision. Let them look, let them wonder. Because I had something now, proof that their entire story about the lake was built on lies, and they didn't know I had it. I returned to the table, spreading the documents into a rough timeline. Deed from 1954. Survey from 1963. The letter from 1987. Every page a reminder that the lake's ownership had never been in question. Not once. Not ever. What the HOA had done wasn't confusion. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was a choice. A deliberate attempt to turn courtesy into ownership and neglect into opportunity. Another gust of wind shook the cabin, rattling the window pane. Outside, clouds slid over the sun again, casting long shadows across the lake. I stared at the documents, feeling the shift inside me. Something firmer, colder, more certain than the anger that had driven me here. This wasn't just about my father's assault anymore. This was about decades of quiet theft wrapped in meeting minutes and fake authority. And now, thanks to my grandfather's letter, I had the first piece needed to pull their whole operation apart. The next question was simple, but heavy. If they ignored this letter, what else were they hiding behind closed HOA doors? I stacked the documents carefully, slid the letter into my jacket pocket, and locked the cabin behind me. The wind picked up again, brushing the surface of the lake like fingers searching for truth beneath the ripples. It was time to dig deeper, a lot deeper. By late morning, the light had sharpened, turning the lake into a silver-blue sheet that rippled beneath the steady push of a northern breeze. The air carried a chill that hinted at an early fall, the kind that made the pine branches sway like they were whispering secrets they'd held too long. I locked the cabin behind me, documents secured in a weatherproof folder tucked under my arm, and started down the dirt road toward town. Gravel cracked under my boots. Twigs snapped. Every sound felt amplified in the quiet woods. Maybe it was just the weight of what I'd discovered, or maybe it was knowing the HOA wasn't finished with me yet. About halfway down the road, an engine hummed behind me. I didn't turn until the sound slowed, tires crunching deliberately. A black county SUV eased to a stop beside me, dust drifting up in slow spirals around the bumper. Deputy Cole Marker stepped out, adjusting his hat against the sun. He was younger than my father, but carried the same outdoors worn look, creases at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been clenched one too many years. He walked toward me with a tight smile, hands resting on his belt. "Morning, Evan," he said. "Heard you were back." "Word travels fast," I replied. "In this valley? Always does." He exhaled and the smile faded. "I also heard there was an incident last night." "Incident," I repeated, letting the words sit heavy. "Is that what they're calling it?" He shifted his weight. "I got a report from the HOA. Says your father was resisting their directives at the shoreline. Says he became aggressive." "My father collapsed," I snapped. "Aggressive isn't the word." Cole nodded slowly, eyes dropping to the dirt. "Yeah, I figured that wasn't the full story. Harold's a good man. Always has been." For a brief moment, his voice softened. Then the official tone returned. "But Marilyn Stark filed the complaint. As of now, it's on record." A gust of wind blew dust along the road, swirling around our feet. I stared at him. "You know this is my family's land." He studied me for a long second. "Look, Evan, off the record? I believe you. But on the record, the HOA has documentation, fake or not, and they like to act like it's gospel." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Stark runs half the board. Folks around here don't cross her because she's loud, persistent, and knows how to make people miserable. She pushed my father to the ground, on our property." His jaw tightened. "I'm not telling you you're wrong. I'm telling you to be careful. She's already got her version filed, and she's got the kind of sway that'll make this messy." I swallowed a slow breath. "I've got proof she's lied for decades." "Then you hold on to that tight," he said, "and get someone who knows how to use it." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He nodded once, then stepped back, pulling open his driver's door. As he climbed in, he added, "Just don't let her bait you. She's trying to get ahead of something. I don't know what yet, but it's big enough she's scared." He paused. "And when someone like Stark's scared, folks get hurt." He closed the door. The SUV rolled off in a cloud of dust, leaving me alone on the road, with the weight of his warning pressing against my ribs. I resumed walking, every step harder, faster. By the time I reached town, a collection of old storefronts, a diner, and a county building that smelled perpetually of warm paper, I already knew where I needed to go next. Attorney Dana Whitmore kept her office above the old hardware store. The building creaked with age, the wood trim peeling in thin curls, but the sign over the door was sharp and new. "Whitmore Legal, Water Rights and Land Use." I pushed open the glass door and went up the stairs. At the top, a bell chimed, and Dana stepped out from behind a filing cabinet. Mid-40s, sharp braid, sharper eyes. The kind of person you didn't lie to unless you wanted your soul scanned like an evidence sheet. "Evan Callister," she said. "Haven't seen you since your uncle's memorial. What brings you in? I lifted the folder. HOA trouble. Her eyebrows rose. Say no more. Sit. Her desk was cluttered in the organized chaos only a seasoned attorney could navigate. Open case files, tabs sticking out like road signs, legal pads filled with notes written in quick, slanting strokes. She cleared a space and motioned for me to lay the folder down. I opened it and spread the documents out. The deed, the aerial surveys, the torn brochure, and finally, last, but most important, the 1987 letter. Dana picked up the letter first. She read it once, then again, then slowly placed it onto the desk like it was made of glass. That, she said, tapping the paper gently, is a problem for them. I waited, pulse thudding in my ears. She looked at the deed next, studied the property map, then leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Evan, this isn't just trespass. This isn't even just encroachment. She lifted the torn HOA brochure with 2 fingers. They have been collecting money for lake access? For years, I said. Tom Halper thinks over a decade. She let out a low whistle. Charging residents for access to land they don't own is illegal, and building structures on private property? Even worse, but this, she tapped the letter again. This destroys any argument they might make about prescriptive easement. That's what I thought. No, she corrected gently. You hoped. Now you know. Wind rattled the office window, making the glass shiver. Outside, a dust devil spun briefly across the street before dissolving. Dana pulled a legal pad toward her. We need more. Records from the HOA, financial statements, meeting minutes. Anything that shows when these structures were approved, who approved them, and what money was spent. What if they won't give it? I asked. She smiled, a small, knowing thing. They won't, so we go through other channels, neighbors, former board members, county filings. And if we find enough to justify action, she leaned forward. We sue, hard. I felt the room tighten around those words. I don't want to fight. I want the truth. With Marilyn Stark, Dana said. They're the same thing. Silence settled for a moment, broken only by the low hum of a box fan in the corner. She studied me, eyes steady, assessing. You're serious about this, she said finally. They put my father in the hospital. Dana nodded once, firmly. Then let's find out just how deep their corruption goes. And there it was, the shift I'd been waiting for. The moment anger began forming into something cleaner, sharper. Resolve. I gathered the documents back into the folder as Dana stood and retrieved her coat. I'll start pulling everything I can today, she said. But Evan... She paused at the door. Be careful. If Stark has something to hide, she won't sit quietly while you uncover it. Outside, the wind picked up again, scattering dust along the sidewalks. The first low rumble of distant thunder rolled across the basin, echoing off the ridge. Storm coming, in more ways than one. By the time I stepped out of Dana Whitmore's office, the sky above Silver Trail Basin had dimmed into a bruised gray. Clouds massed along the ridgeline, rolling low like they were waiting for a signal. The kind of weather that made the pines shiver and old-timers swear their knees hurt. I pulled my jacket tighter and started toward the truck, the wind pushing dust in restless swirls across Main Street. I didn't head straight back to the cabin. Not yet. Something in me needed to walk. To feel the basin beneath my boots the way I did when I was a kid chasing trout along the creek bed. So I cut behind the diner, following the old service road that wound toward the woods behind town. Every step grounded me, pushed yesterday's shock into something sharper, purpose. Halfway along the road, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Dana. Call me, now. I stopped beside a leaning fence post and hit the call button. She answered immediately. You're not going to believe this, she said, voice tight with that particular mix of anger and adrenaline lawyers get when they smell a breach. I reached out to a former board treasurer, quiet guy, always hated Stark. He wouldn't talk at first, but when I mentioned your father's name, he opened up. What did he say? You were right, she said. There's money missing, a lot of it. A gust of wind rattled the fence beside me, the wood groaning like it was straining under weight. How much? A beat of silence. Over $400,000 in lake fees across 15 years, and only a fraction went to anything resembling maintenance. I gripped the phone harder. Where did the rest go? That's the part he wouldn't say on a call, Dana answered. He won't text it either. But he agreed to meet. Tonight, 8 o'clock. Behind the millworks on County Road 7. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Not close yet, but coming. I'll be there. I ended the call and took a long breath, letting the wind cool the heat building behind my ribs. The HOA had been charging families for access to my family's lake. Fees for permits, dock repairs, shoreline cleanup, community water management. Residents thought they were paying for community upkeep, but the lake hadn't seen more than a handful of improvements in decades. Anyone with eyes could see that. I wanted answers, and I needed to see exactly how deep Marilyn Stark's reach went. When evening settled, the sky bruised into a darker shade of blue, I drove toward County Road 7. The millworks sat at the edge of the old lumber yard, a forgotten place with leaning metal beams, crooked gutters, and broken windows that rattled when the wind pushed through the cracks. My headlights flashed across stacks of weathered planks before I killed the engine. I stepped out. The air smelled like damp sawdust and rain-soaked dirt. A single lamppost flickered near the corner of the building, drawing moths like sparks. That's when I heard a car door close gently on the far side of the yard. A man stepped out of the shadows, coat zipped up to his chin, collar turned against the wind, stocky, early 60s, graying hair. His eyes darted around before he walked closer. You, Evan? He asked quietly. Yeah, I said. You must be Larson. He nodded. Used to handle finances for the HOA, before Stark pushed me out. I could hear the bitterness in those words. Not angry, just tired, like someone who'd swallowed something foul for too many years. Dana said you had information. He glanced around again before speaking. Stark's been redirecting money, lake fees, special assessments, donations. She tells the board it's for water testing, shoreline repairs, environmental studies. Sounds official enough that most folks don't look twice. He exhaled a shaky sound. But the payments, they don't add up. How do you mean? They go to a company called Stark Property Solutions. His eyes met mine. Her husband's LLC. The wind hit harder then, whipping leaves into little hurricanes along the dirt. I felt the shift inside my chest, like a gear locking into place. How long has this been going on? I asked. Since 2017 at least, he said. Maybe longer, but I only saw the books from my years, and let me tell you, they were cooked cleaner than a Sunday roast. Round number withdrawals, no itemized invoices, vague descriptions, and always, money flowing back to that LLC. A pause. Then, I tried to raise concerns once, at a board meeting. He swallowed. Next thing I knew, Stark claimed I mishandled funds, got me removed. Just like that. A shadow moved through the trees behind the mill, making both of us stiffen. But it was only the wind pushing a loose shutter, slamming it gently. Larson let out a shaky breath. I don't know what she's trying to build, he said softly, but it isn't community, and it sure as hell isn't legal. I nodded slowly. You willing to testify? He hesitated. Fear flickered through his eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of Stark, of her influence, of what she'd done before and what she might do again. "I'll think about it," he said. "But for now..." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small stack of folded papers. "These are photocopies, 7 years' worth. They're partial, but enough to show a pattern." I took the papers, feeling the weight of them. Rain began to fall, cold drops tapping on rusted metal, gathering into rivulets along the beams. "Use them wisely," Larson said. "And be careful. Stark watches anyone who threatens her." He left before the storm broke fully, climbing into his car and fading into the night. I stood there a moment longer, letting the rain hit my face, letting the truth soak into me with the cold. When I returned to my truck, I unfolded the papers. Each one told the same story. Withdrawals listed as shoreline preservation. Payments to Stark Property Solutions. Amounts: $32,000, $45,000, $28,500. No receipts, no contractor names. Fraud, plain and simple. Lightning cracked above the timberline, illuminating the basin like a flashbulb. Brief, brilliant, merciless. The wind howled in through the trees, pushing rain against the windshield like handfuls of gravel. I started the engine. The storm was here now. Loud, violent, unignorable. And so was the truth. If Stark thought she could hide behind rules and paperwork, she hadn't counted on one thing. Paper trails don't lie. People do. And I had just found the first path that would lead straight to the heart of her corruption. By the next morning, the storm had passed, but the sky hung low and heavy with leftover clouds, as if the basin wasn't ready to lift its head yet. My father was finally home from the hospital, resting under a thick quilt in the cabin's front room. He looked tired, smaller somehow, but the stubbornness in his eyes hadn't dimmed. "You don't need to go making trouble on my account," he murmured, voice thin but steady. "Dad," I said, placing the folder beside him, "they already made trouble. I'm just answering it." He didn't argue. That alone told me how serious this was. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 6 o'clock at the community pavilion, a wooden structure built years ago beside the subdivision's entrance, back before Stark decided the lake was hers to run. People rarely filled the place unless someone's dog trespassed or the board proposed raising dues, but tonight would be different. I spent the afternoon preparing. I printed copies of the deed, highlighted the key sections. I placed the 1987 letter in a protective sleeve. I reviewed Larson's financial pages until the ink blurred in my vision. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, my thoughts had sharpened into something cold and clear. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the first public crack in Stark's armor. As I walked toward the pavilion, the gravel felt loose under my boots. Light flickered inside from strings of overhead bulbs, their warm glow cutting through the early dusk. When I pushed the door open, the hum of quiet conversation stopped. 60 people were there, maybe more. Young couples, retirees, folks I vaguely remembered from childhood summers. Even Tom Halper was in the back row, leaning on his cane with that watchful look older men carry when they've lived through too many injustices. At the front, seated like she owned the place, was Marilyn Stark. She wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings, hair pulled tight like she was preparing for a televised interview. Her expression stayed neutral, but when she saw me, a flicker passed through her eyes, something between annoyance and calculation. "Mr. Callister," she said, voice bright and clipped, "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "I'm a resident," I replied, "and my family owns land that borders this community." Her smile stretched thin. "Well, you may observe, but this meeting concerns HOA matters, not outside disputes." The murmurs in the room shifted. People glanced at one another. I walked to the back, leaning against a support beam. Stark straightened her papers, cleared her throat, and began the meeting. Minutes, budget updates, community announcements. She moved through them with mechanical confidence. But her voice strained at the edges, and she avoided looking in my direction. On the far right, her husband Richard sat scribbling in a binder, pretending to take notes, his jaw clenching every time Stark mentioned lake management. After nearly 40 minutes, Stark set her papers aside. "Public comment period," she said, tapping the mic. 3 minutes per speaker. A man in the front row stood to complain about a neighbor's fence height. A woman asked about road maintenance. Stark responded politely, but dismissively to each, controlling the pace like she always did. Then silence. "Any others?" Stark asked. "If not, we'll—" I raised my hand. Every head turned. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to pause. Stark's smile froze. "Mr. Callister, this is not an appropriate—" I stepped to the microphone. "Thank you for your time," I began, keeping my voice steady. "My name is Evan Callister. My family has owned the lakefront property adjacent to this subdivision since 1954, and last night, the HOA called 911 on my father while he was standing on that land." People whispered. Chairs scraped. Even those who didn't know me leaned forward. "I'd like to know," I continued, "on what legal basis this HOA claims authority over Silver Trail Lake." Stark's face hardened. "Mr. Callister, the HOA has managed the lake as a community amenity for over 30 years. This is established practice." "That's interesting," I said, "because the deed says otherwise." A ripple moved through the audience. I pulled a printed page from my folder and held it up. "This deed," I said clearly, "records the Callister family as the sole owners of the lake. There is no easement, no partnership, no shared rights." Richard shifted, whispering something urgently to Stark. "And," I added, pulling out the 1987 letter, "this document, written by my grandfather, was sent to the original board. It states that neighbors may access the lake by courtesy only, not ownership, and that the courtesy is revocable at any time." Gasps. Someone muttered, "I knew it." Stark gripped the microphone. "This is not legitimate." I cut her off, my voice calm but sharp. "Is it not legitimate because it disproves the story you've been telling everyone? Or because it shows you've been collecting unlawful fees for lake access?" Silence swallowed the room. People looked at one another. Then at Stark. Then at me again. "What fees?" a woman in the second row asked. I held up Larson's financial copies. "These fees. 15 years' worth. Shoreline fees. Lake usage fees. Maintenance assessments. All charged under the assumption that the HOA owns the lake. But the money didn't go to lake maintenance." Stark's face drained of color. "It went," I said, "to Stark Property Solutions, LLC." A man in the back stood up. "That's her husband's company." The entire room erupted. Questions, outrage, disbelief. Stark slammed the microphone off, but her voice didn't stand a chance against the rising noise. I let the moment build just long enough before turning the mic back on. "I will be filing a lawsuit Monday morning," I said, voice steady, "for land fraud, for unlawful fees, for trespass, and for what happened to my father." A hush fell instantly. "My attorney will be seeking a full audit of HOA finances," I continued, "and I will make every document available to any resident who wants to see how their money has been used." People began lining up to speak to me. Hands grabbed my sleeve. Questions poured out. Quiet, urgent, desperate. Behind me, Stark stood frozen, lips pressed tight, eyes wide in something I'd never seen on her before. Fear. The meeting ended in chaos. Residents surrounding us, demanding answers, demanding refunds, demanding truth. Richard stormed out the side door. Stark vanished into a hallway. But their silence? That spoke louder than any denial ever could. As I stepped back out into the cool night, wind rustling the pavilion's edge, I felt something shift across the basin. Not the storm, not the weather, the community. They'd finally seen behind her curtain, and there was no covering it up now. By the time Monday arrived, the basin felt different, charged, unsettled, like everyone was waiting for something to break. News of the HOA meeting had spread faster than wildfire on a dry ridge. By noon, a handful of residents had already shown up at the cabin, asking questions, offering old paperwork, digging through memory for anything that might help. But the real storm was gathering at the courthouse. I pulled into the gravel lot just after 9. Thunderheads lingered low above the mountains, their dark undersides mirroring the tension in my chest. The courthouse itself stood at the edge of town. Old brick, iron-framed windows, wooden doors worn smooth by decades of hands pushing them open. It smelled of varnish, dust, and the faint lingering scent of coffee from the clerk's window. Inside, Attorney Dana Whitmore was waiting for me, a legal pad tucked under one arm, her expression pinched with focus. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." We walked down the hallway, the soft click of her heels mixing with the heavier thud of my boots. My father sat on a bench near the door to the courtroom. He was pale but steady, a blanket folded across his lap. My mother sat beside him, rubbing his hand gently. "Dad," I said quietly, "you sure you want to be here?" He gave me a look, not angry, not even stern, just deeply certain. "They took enough from us, son. They don't get to take my presence, too." Dana nodded approvingly. "If you feel up to it, Mr. Callister, your being here matters." The bailiff opened the courtroom doors, and we stepped into the chamber. It was fuller than I expected, nearly every bench filled. Some folks were familiar. Neighbors, old friends, people who'd grown up fishing the same waters I did. Others were new faces, residents of the subdivision who were only now realizing they might have funded something rotten. At the front sat Judge Rebecca Aldridge, her silver hair pulled back, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She had the kind of calm that could silence a room without raising her voice. I'd only seen her once before, years ago, but I remembered her reputation. Fair, sharp, unshakable. Across the aisle sat the HOA delegation. Marilyn Stark wore a charcoal suit jacket over a crisp blouse, but her composure from the meeting was gone. Her hands gripped a pen so tightly I thought it might snap. Her husband Richard stared down at a binder, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Their attorney, Gerald Foster, stood stiffly beside them. A tall man, with a face that looked carved from cold granite. He shuffled his papers and glanced our way, sizing us up. But Dana didn't blink. She was already unfolding her documents with the slow precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The judge cleared her throat. "We're here today regarding Callister v. Silver Trail Estates, HOA. I've reviewed the preliminary filings. Counsel, you may begin." Foster rose first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this dispute is based on a misunderstanding. The HOA has managed Silver Trail Lake for over 3 decades with established community usage. Residents have relied on this access, and the Callister family never objected until recently." He paced slightly. "We believe this matter concerns implied consent, long-standing community practice, and the need to preserve stability for residents." I felt Dana shift beside me. Her tone when she rose was cool and measured. "Your Honor, with respect, nothing about this case is a misunderstanding." She handed a binder to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. "That binder includes the original Callister deed, which names the family as sole owners of the lake. It includes a 1987 letter sent to the HOA's predecessor organization explicitly stating that any lake access was a courtesy, not a right, not an easement, not a transfer." Judge Aldridge flipped open the binder and read silently for a few moments. The courtroom waited, breath held. Dana continued, "Furthermore, we have documentation showing the HOA constructed docks, installed signage, created pathways, and placed structures on Callister property without permission. Each of these actions constitutes trespass. Foster cleared his throat loudly. Your Honor. Dana didn't let him interrupt. And finally, she said, lifting a second stack of papers, we have evidence that the HOA collected more than $400,000 in lake-related fees over the past 15 years, a fund they had no legal authority to create. Murmurs rippled through the benches. I saw residents glance nervously at one another, eyes widening, anger rising. Judge Aldridge looked up. Mr. Foster, do you contest the authenticity of these documents? Foster swallowed. We need additional time to review them. Aldridge raised an eyebrow. You've had 3 days. Dana took a step forward. Your Honor, unless the defense can produce deed transfers, recorded easements, or historical agreements proving their claim to the lake, their argument relies on assumptions and community folklore, not law. Foster's voice tightened. This is a community matter. No, Dana cut in. This is a property matter, and the law is clear. The judge tapped her glasses lightly with her pen. I'd like to hear from Mr. Callister. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs as I stood. The room was so quiet the old wooden floor creaked beneath me. Your Honor, I said. My father was pushed to the ground on land he's maintained for 60 years. They called 911 on him. They told him he didn't belong on property our family has protected for generations. I swallowed, steadying myself. We aren't here to punish the community, but we are here to stop a board from abusing power they never had. Judge Aldridge nodded once. Slow, understanding, decisive. And then came the moment everything shifted. Dana approached the bench with the last document we had, Larson's financial pages. Your Honor, she said, there is one more matter. These records show over $100,000 transferred to a private company, Stark Property Solutions LLC, owned by the HOA president's husband. The courtroom gasped. Richard Stark stiffened, turning pale. Marilyn's hand twitched violently, sending her pen clattering to the floor. Judge Aldridge took the documents, scanned them, then set them down carefully. Mr. Foster, she said, voice low and controlled, are you aware of these transactions? Foster's silence was damning. The judge leaned forward. I am granting the plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction. Effective immediately, the HOA is to cease all activity on Callister property. All structures must be removed within 30 days. The room erupted, shocked voices, shouts, relief, indignation. But the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, she continued, raising her voice over the noise, I am ordering a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances to be conducted by an independent accountant. Any attempts to withhold information will be met with sanctions. She turned a hard gaze toward Marilyn. And Mrs. Stark, you may wish to retain separate counsel. The allegations presented today may have criminal implications. Marilyn's face drained to ash. Richard put his head in his hands. The judge banged her gavel once. Court is adjourned. As the crowd surged with questions, outrage, and hurried whispers, I looked at my father. His eyes were wet. Not from pain, but from something like vindication. Wind shook the old courthouse windows as if the basin itself was exhaling. Justice had finally stepped into the room. But the biggest twist, the one none of us expected yet, was still on its way. When we stepped out of the courthouse, the afternoon light had softened into a warm amber glow that settled across the valley like a blanket. The storm clouds had fully broken apart, leaving streaks of blue above the ridgeline. You'd think the world would feel lighter after a ruling like that. But the air carried a strange tension, one that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My father gripped my arm as he walked. Your grandfather would have wanted to see this day, he whispered. His voice wasn't shaky anymore. It held something sturdier, something reclaimed. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. Reporters lingered near the courthouse steps, but Dana guided us away through a side exit. She knew better than to let the crowd swarm Dad. We reached the dirt lot where our truck sat beneath the shade of tall cottonwoods. That was only the beginning, she said, sliding her briefcase into her back seat. The audit's going to open a can of worms they won't be able to close. Before she could say more, a county sedan turned into the lot, gravel crunching under its tires. The car stopped beside us, and a man stepped out, mid-50s, dark suit, state seal pinned above his pocket. I recognized him immediately from news briefings. Samuel Rowan, the Montana governor's liaison for environmental and land conservation policy. He carried a sealed envelope in his hand. "Mr. Callister?" he asked as he approached. I stared. "That's me." Rowan nodded politely, then turned to shake my father's hand. "And you must be Harold." Dad blinked. "Do I know you?" "Not personally," Rowan said. His voice was calm but urgent. "But the governor's office is familiar with your work." "My work?" Dad echoed. Instead of answering, Rowan extended the envelope to me. "This arrived at the governor's desk earlier today," he said. "It's in relation to the hearing." Dana stepped closer, brows pulling tight. "What's this about?" Rowan exhaled. "You'll want to open it." I slid a thumb beneath the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was thick, official, the kind with a watermark you could feel. At the top, the governor's seal gleamed in gold. My eyes moved down the page, first slowly, then faster, then back up again, because the words didn't seem real. "The state of Montana hereby confirms that Silver Trail Lake is subject to conservation protections enacted under the Harold Callister Environmental Stewardship Act, established in 1998. My breath caught. I kept reading. "Due to Mr. Callister's documented contributions as a state park ranger and his environmental restoration work, Silver Trail Lake is protected under a legacy clause designating it as a privately held conservation body. No private organization, governing board, or association may assert authority over its use or management." Dad stared at me. "Evan, what does it say?" I looked up at him, stunned. "Dad, you have a law named after you." His mouth fell open. "What?" Rowan stepped forward gently. "Mr. Callister, the act was drafted based on restoration initiatives you led in the late 90s. You mapped watersheds, cleaned tributaries, advocated for wildlife protections. Your reports were the foundation of the bill. It passed with quiet bipartisan support." Dad shook his head like he was trying to clear water from his ears. "That was just field work. Just doing my job." "Sometimes doing your job changes things," Rowan said. "The governor felt you deserved to know that your work wasn't forgotten." I swallowed, feeling the weight of it. "So what does this mean for the lake?" Rowan's answer was simple. "It means the HOA had zero authority, not just legally, but state-protected legally. They violated a conservation law without even knowing it." Dana let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. "This changes everything," Rowan continued. "We are forwarding the findings of this case to the state attorney general. If the audit reveals fraud or misappropriation of funds, as Judge Aldridge suspects, criminal charges may follow." Dad lowered himself onto a nearby bench, legs suddenly weak. Mom sat beside him, taking his hand tightly. Tears filled her eyes. "I just wanted them to leave us alone," Dad whispered. "That's all I ever wanted." Rowan nodded. "And now they will. The governor asked me to offer your family his respect and his gratitude." He shook my hand again, then my mother's, then my father's. With a final nod, he returned to his sedan and drove off, leaving dust curling in the air behind him. When he was gone, the valley grew quiet, just the wind brushing through cottonwood leaves and the distant call of a hawk somewhere over the ridge. "Dad," I said softly, sitting beside him, "you didn't just protect the lake. You preserved it for the next generation." He chuckled weakly, wiping his eyes. And here I thought I was just filing reports nobody read. Dana stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. "This gives us everything we need. The injunction stands even stronger. The audit will be mandatory. And Marilyn Stark has nowhere to run." I stood slowly, staring out over the distant outline of the basin. The late sun cast long shadows over the pines, stretching like fingers toward the lake. The lake I grew up on. The lake my father protected. The lake my grandfather defended. The lake the HOA thought they could take. Not anymore. Because in one afternoon, the truth had outgrown the lies that buried it. Stark believed she could twist land rights, bully neighbors, and rewrite history. But she didn't know history belonged to us. And now? It was coming for her. All that remained was the final reckoning, the cleanup, the justice that would bring everything full circle. But first, I needed to return to the lake one more time, stand where this began, and prepare for the end of the fight. Because this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about restoring what the lake had always known, who it truly belonged to. The next morning arrived clear and still. One of those rare Montana mornings when the air felt freshly washed, the sky rinsed clean of clouds, and the lake lay flat as polished stone. Sunlight hit the water in soft, warm patches, drifting like slow-moving lanterns across its surface. For the first time in weeks, the basin felt quiet, honest, like it could breathe again. But beneath that stillness was something else, a sense of finality, the kind that comes after a long storm, when everything broken has to be gathered and put right. Dana called just after sunrise. "It's done," she said simply. "We got the audit results." Her voice carried a weight I understood immediately. I drove to her office in town. The gravel under my tires felt different now, less like resistance, more like a path clearing itself. When I stepped inside, she was already standing by the window, a thick binder on her desk, color-coded tabs sticking out like a row of warning flags. Without a word, she opened it to the first page and let me read. $302,700 siphoned into Stark Property Solutions, LLC. No corresponding receipts, no invoices, no vendor lists. 10 years of fabricated shoreline improvements and environmental services. Multiple signatures forged or unauthorized. It was worse than I imagined, and exactly what I expected. Dana tapped a line item with her pen. "This one's the key. $45,000 labeled Lake Property Enhancement. Paid directly to Richard's company. No contract, no documentation, nothing but a line on a spreadsheet." She looked up at me, eyes steady. "That's the nail in the coffin." Across town, word spread fast. Residents started gathering near the pavilion. Some held documents, old receipts, HOA newsletters, meeting minutes with red circles drawn around any mention of the lake. Others didn't bring anything except questions and anger. I made my way through the crowd, answering what I could, listening when I needed to. People were frustrated, yes, but more than that, they felt betrayed. Years of trust, broken by greed wrapped in HOA letterhead. By noon, law enforcement had arrived. Deputy Cole Marker approached me first, his expression somewhere between grim and relieved. "We executed the warrant," he said quietly. "Richard Stark is in custody. Charges pending." I exhaled, shoulders dropping with a heaviness I didn't know I'd been carrying. "And Marilyn?" I asked. Cole looked toward the pavilion, where 2 county investigators stood at the entrance. "She resigned this morning," he said. "Board's dissolved. She lawyered up. You probably won't see her again in town." For the first time since that night in the hospital, something inside me loosened. The basin felt different again, lighter, cleaner. But I still needed to go home. I drove back to the cabin slowly, letting the pine shadows flicker across the road like passing memories. When I pulled into the dirt driveway, my father was outside on the porch, blanket over his knees, a thermos of coffee steaming beside him. Mom sat next to him, her hand resting on his arm. "You look like a man who's been carrying stones up a mountain," Dad said as I approached. "It's done," I said. "The audit, the charges, the resignations, all of it." He nodded, taking a slow breath. "Good." We walked down to the lake together. Dad moved carefully but refused my help on the slope, stubborn as ever. When we reached the shoreline, he stared out over the water for a long time, blinking against the brightness. The dock the HOA built was already half disassembled, boards stacked neatly beside the path. County workers must have started early. The benches were gone. The gaudy members-only signs had been pulled like rotten weeds. Only the lake remained, unchanged, unclaimed, unbroken. Dad lowered himself onto the old rock he'd sat on since I was a kid, the one where he taught me to tie fishing knots, where we cleaned trout on summer evenings, where he once told me, "A man's character is measured by how he treats land that can't argue back." He touched the water with his fingertips. "Feels like it's ours again," he said softly. "It always was," I told him. The sun had begun its slow descent, turning the lake copper gold. Light shimmered across the surface, catching in the ripples like tiny stars. The breeze carried the scent of wet stone, pine sap, and something older, something that had always lived in these waters. My father looked at me, eyes shining, but not with sadness, with pride. "You protected what we built," he said. "Your grandfather, your uncle, me. You stood up for all of us." I swallowed against the tightness in my chest. I just followed the truth. "That's the hardest path," he whispered. "Most men take shortcuts." A loon called somewhere across the lake, its cry echoing through the trees like a note from another time. The water glimmered, smooth again, untouched. Dad leaned back slightly, gazing at the horizon. "Your grandfather used to say, 'The lake speaks when the world gets quiet enough to hear it.'" I looked out over the water, listening. Time slowed, wind hushed, sunlight shimmered, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like the lake was speaking the truth it had held for generations. Callister land, Callister water, Callister legacy. I placed my hand on Dad's shoulder. "Dad," I said softly, "we got our land back." He closed his eyes and smiled, a warm, peaceful smile that carried 50-year bows of memories, love, and quiet battles fought in the shadows. We sat there until the sun dipped low and the basin grew cool again, the world settling into a calm that felt hard-earned. Justice had come. Not loudly, not violently, but the way water shapes stone, patient, persistent, inevitable. And as the light faded across Silver Trail Lake, one truth stood steady. The lake finally spoke, and this time, everyone heard it. If you've ever stood your ground against an HOA or anyone who tried to take what's yours, drop a simple yes in the comments. Justice doesn't always roar. It often shows up quietly, the way truth does. And if you want more stories where honesty, grit, and good folks win in the end, go on and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.